Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's actually a very important moment because Stanislaus von Moos, our founder of Archithese, he always emphasized the importance the AA had or has for the setup of Archithese 40 years ago. Okay, thank you. Well, Mario Capo was almost right. The editor has the last word, so I conclude with the last talk. And as an editor, also assembled some voices from the past. You could almost say that looking at the field, I dug them out. But it's supposed to be a bit of a spring talk to restore the spirit. And with the sun shining outside, not regretting it too much. So I start with a quote by Frank Lloyd Wright, who said, "Therefore, to the young man in architecture, the word radical should be a beautiful word. Radical means off the root or to the root, begins at the beginning, and word stands up straight. Any architect should be radical by nature, because it is not enough for him to begin where others have left off." So he wrote, or he spoke in 1931. It was published as in Future of Architecture, and we can speculate whether it's still the future of architecture today, or maybe even the future of criticism. Well, despite being young myself, I actually continue a tradition that is already 40 years old. Archithese was founded in 1971 with a series of 3 that looked like that. And which also somehow made us part of Beatrice Illuminas Magazine. Is it? Part of the magazine Clipstamp Fold. The radical architecture of the little magazines. So we're still small today. We're 2 people. It's Hubertus Adam, art historian, and myself. And we publish 6 issues a year, still today. We have no news, we have no agenda, and therefore also no Twitter, no blog, and a rather poor website. Here's some recent issues. Issue on randomness, where Madeleine Friesendorp designed the cover image for us. And here one to emphasize the relationship to the A, with Brian Anson being radical, a photo taken by Dennis Crumpton, as at Bottoms once told me. Now by circulating those issues, I can actually show what the main problem is today. It's the problem of distribution, getting it to the people. While some are looking at it and experience the immediacy, others might Twitter and say, "Oh, it's a really exciting magazine," or the "OMG, I saw an original first edition of Archithese." But we do work on an English electronic version, also because the debate of architecture, it moved to an international level, or definitely now those who want to participate in the leading debate do normally discuss it in English. And the relationship to Switzerland is nevertheless fundamental for us. And even though it's a kind of a hate-love relationship, as Stanislaus von Moos stressed in an interview that is included in Clipstamp Fold, where he says, "What was going on in Switzerland didn't especially interest me. I just wanted to make an interesting magazine." Here it's worth recalling Bernard Hössli, one of the Texas Rangers and former head of ETH, who paradigmatically described Switzerland's troubled relationship with theory. That was in 1958. "We rarely originate, but we are skillful at adapting. We are reluctant to push ahead, and we prefer to wait. We dislike to abandon the familiar and we are skeptical of the new. The different is suspect, the exceptional is not welcome, and genius is ignored. But Switzerland also allowed us to grow into what we are. We now do magazines with 120 pages rather than 50 pages, even some, or other people might say too much of it is advertisement. And by that, it triggers, or it reminded me of Brad Steele, who a couple of days ago said, actually nowadays everything is conspiracy theory because no one really dares or manages to read Patrick Schumacher's manifesto or monography. It's an interesting work because it's actually comprehensive, and not many people do attempt that nowadays. But there's more change in our world. We have seen offices that grew from being avant-garde to now employing hundreds of people. They also employ their own PR people. They employ their press officers. So a lot of immediacy is lost. This professionalization on the one side is then reflected by academia, which is as thorough as probably no one before and produces a tremendous amount of in-depth and very deep research. And then we have the blogs, we have the tweets, we have the platforms that for us as a magazine, they vary somehow between Thomson Reuters, a news agency, and a personal comment. But usually and most often they're quite specific and limited in their bandwidth. Now, all that situation prompted me or provoked an intuitive jump. And I had the feeling it feels a bit like privatization of television when that happened years ago. And so I thought, what about the public purpose? What about, say, the BBC? How do they define their own idle image of a media? And I thought, in a way, if you replaced it by Switzerland and architecture, it's actually not that far off what we aspire to do. And it says, sustaining citizenship and civil society, independent journalism of highest quality, encourage conversation and debate. Then, secondly, promoting education and learning, looking for ways of making factual programming enjoyable for diverse audiences, stimulating creativity and cultural excellence, representing the UK, its regions and communities, that's obviously also the case in Switzerland, bringing the UK to the world and the world to the UK, build a global understanding of international issues and enable individuals to participate in the global debate on significant international issues. And lastly, delivering to the public the benefit of emerging communications, technologies and services. Well, we could say this is a rather idle and very coded way of describing a certain ethics. But nevertheless, I think it's something to warrant a high quality, a high average, a good society, nice and neat. Now it's the question whether this is enough. But being part of our professional world today, it also means we have to nurse and maintain relationships. So there, the corporate idea continues. And in reference to Craig Lynn's contributions or editing of folding architecture and architectural design of 1992, where he talked about the pliant, we could actually call it pliant criticism. And he says, unlike an architecture of contradictions, superpositions, and accidental collisions, pliant systems are capable of engendering unpredicted connections with contextual, cultural, programmatic, structural, and economic contingencies by vicissitude. Vicissitude is often equated with vacillation, weakness, and indecisiveness, but more importantly, these characteristics are frequently in the service of a tactical cunning. Vicissitude is a quality of being mutable or changeable, in response to both favorable and unfavorable situations that occur by chance. Well, in a way, this is a question of attitude. And I think Lin not just described new architecture, he also described a new idea of architecture where actually the interconnectedness of the profession wasn't just generating avant-garde architecture, but also left a lot of people trapped in the urge to combine many, many interests. And this is why I chose this image of Steve McQueen as Frank in Bullet, which doesn't only feature one of the best car chases in film history, but also shows a remarkable, well, probably American idea of attitude and how he behaves towards Chalmers, an FBI or CIA man who tries to lure him into a task that he also accepts, but of course by offering career steps. And well, Steve McQueen then insists on doing it his way. But also this question of negotiation goes back quite a long time. If we go back to Thomas More, then he wrote in 1516 in Utopia, where Raphael is talking about the king of Happyland and his ethical ideas, and discusses that with Thomas More. And he said, if I said things like that to people who were quite determined to take the opposite view, do you think they'd listen to me? And Moore replies, of course they wouldn't. And I can't say I'd blame them. Frankly, I don't see the point of saying things like that, or of giving advice that you know they'll never accept. What possible good could it do? How can they be expected to take in a totally unfamiliar line of thought which goes against all their deepest prejudices? Raphael, there's no room at court for philosophy. There's certainly no room for the academic variety which says what it thinks irrespective of circumstances. Well, I think the problem increases proportionally to the time we spend within the relationships, within the system. So I'm fairly new to the business, and you're faced with these questions. And the problem, I think, starts when you say if you want to grow, you make career, you survive, you hang on. And this we can oppose, or we can judge against a more organic understanding, like Buckminster Fuller that said there is no failure in nature. And I think then things simply appear and disappear, very much like most of the little magazines. Most of the magazines, they appeared, they did a couple of issues, and they disappeared again. And they constituted culture for a moment. And I think culture also has this organic, transformative, but nevertheless transgressive quality. But if you do only a couple of issues, then you can actually do and practice a certain hit and run journalism and a take no prisoner journalism, as Martin Pauly once called it. And you suddenly you're allowed to be in that situation where even you can call bullshit when you want to call something bullshit. So in criticism and media, if we want to continue to be relevant, I think we need to be somehow ruthless. We need to be able to burn our beloved friends, or at least we need to scrutinize their substance. We need to require and regain a certain independence. We need to be curious. We need to trust our feelings. We need to feel the urgency. We need to have an urge for relevance. And we need to respond also maybe sometimes to boredom if something doesn't interest us. And we get tired of it, and we move on. And I think against the growing professionalism, which I don't want to condemn, but I think it's a place to speculate on alternatives, we can only position ourselves, and with the magazines, with this advocation of passion, and allow room for that, for total freedom that is protected from restrictions, that is also mostly protected from an environment of external forces, from control, and offer an intellectual training ground to roam freely. And I think this is what we aspire to as a magazine. Maybe lastly, I go back to something that I discovered throughout my preparations, and it's Sullivan who compared emotional architecture with intellectual in 1894. And it's a bit churchish, but since it's also a bit about spirit, I'll include it as an end to my talk. How strange it seems that education and practice so often means suppression, that instead of leading the mind outward to the light of the day, it crowds things in that darken and vary it. Yet evidently, the true object of education, now as ever, is to develop the capabilities of the head and the heart. And then he goes on and talks about intuition and imagination, sounding a bit like a priest. And then he concludes, these two great desires, which are in essence the desire to absorb and the desire to know and the desire to test, the desire to hear and the desire to utter, are the basis not only of a true and effective education, not only are they the wholesome body and the enchanting voice of art, but they are greater than these, for they are the animating quality of that higher purpose and significance of art that we call poetry. And he summarizes the process of artistic creation, which starts with the moment of inspiration and imagination. And he continues, then comes the thought, the faculty that doubts and inquires, that slowly systemizes, that formulates, that concentrates, that makes very firm and sure. And lastly comes expression, exuberant in life and movement, open-armed and free, supple, active, dramatic, beautifully pensive, persuasive, wonderful. And the alternative? Man may set things side by side. It will remain to the end what it was in the beginning. Impotent to inspire, dead, absolutely dead. Thank you.
I think we came to the end of the talks, and I would like to thank all the speakers. And I think this afternoon, going through readings, Dasbau, exhibitions, little magazines, we got a taste not only of the diversity of functions of writing and the diversity of forms of practice. I would ask everybody to have take a cup of coffee and perhaps come back in not later than 15 minutes so that we have our final discussion. I'm sure that there must be quite a few questions from the audience, so please try to put your questions together. 20, that's fine. No, it will be 20 minutes, don't worry. Please have a rest, have a breather, and then